Our goal, and I hope that Laura, Johann, and Daniel agree with the goal that I have written down here, is to discuss the changing relationship between teaching disciplinary history, especially in gen ed courses, and our goals for civic learning. Or as one friend of mine once put it, if I can remember this correctly, there is no civics without history, and there's really very little point to doing history unless we're thinking about civics. And that is something that I believe, and I think that is something that all three of my colleagues believe. So I am going to introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak. They will each speak for roughly 5 to 7 minutes. I hope that's what is the understanding. Okay, this would be a whole lot better if I did this, but and then we will have conversation among the group, which is really going to be hard. We're going to figure that out, and then we're going to open it up to the audience here. So, Johann Neem, lower left-hand corner, is professor of history at Western Washington University and editor of the Journal of the Early Republic. His book, Democracy's Schools, The Rise of Publication in America, explores how and why education became a public good. And I'm going to say that again. How and why education became a public good in the decades after the American Revolution. That's a very long time ago. I strongly recommend that everybody in this room go find that book and find a relevant paragraph to send to your legislator. Again, how and why education became a public good in the decades after the American Revolution. He is also the author of Creating a Nation of Joiners, Democracy and Civil Society in Early National Massachusetts, and What's the Point of College? Seeking Purpose in an Age of Reform. His public writing has appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Hedgehog Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, USA Today, the Washington Post, and a bunch of other places. When I welcomed you earlier, I said something about how I hope people will feel free to disagree with one another and we welcome controversy. I'm going to add that I first encountered Johann, as he will remember, through his criticism of the AHA. Dan McInerney was talking about the AHA's tuning project, and when we launched our tuning project, we immediately received criticism from Johann about what the problems were with our tuning project, et cetera, et cetera. And Johann and I have become friends in part through the process of disagreement on all sorts of various things. This is why we are here. Daniel Immerwahr is professor of history at Northwestern University, where he teaches global history and U.S. foreign relations. His first book, Thinking Small, A History of U.S. Grassroots Anti-Poverty Strategies, won a prize from the Organization of American Historians for the best work in U.S. intellectual history. His second book, How to Hide an Empire, a retelling of U.S. history with the overseas parts of the country included in the story, was a national bestseller. I encourage all of you to read it, and won a book prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. Immerwahr is currently working on 2 projects, one on popular culture and U.S. global hegemony, and the other a book about 19th century urban catastrophes. Daniel's writings have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic, Guardian, Slate, The Nation, and the New Republic. Those of you who, I should say, and I'll talk about Laura as well, those of you who think that historians don't know how to speak to the public and need to be taught how to speak to the public can look at Daniel's work, Johann's work, many other people. We're perfectly capable of writing for these kinds of journals. We just need to do it. Laura Westhoff is professor and chair of the history department at the University of Missouri-St. Louis. She has published her research on U.S. Gilded Age and Progressive Era Reform, democracy and social movements, the scholarship of teaching and learning, and the history of education. She's the author of A Fatal Drifting Apart, Democratic Social Knowledge and Chicago Reform, which examines social construction of knowledge and emerging tensions between democracy and expertise in modern America, which is something that more people ought to be thinking about because it's something that people are talking about without thinking about. Laura's work has been published in the Journal of American History, The History Teacher, Women's History Review, and the History of Education Quarterly. Until her current stint as department chair, she had a joint appointment in the College of Education at University of Missouri-St. Louis and remains committed to advancing history education at all levels and has worked very closely with the AHA on all sorts of teaching things that we've been doing. So, you have three very distinguished, very articulate panelists, all three of whom are extremely good at talking to all sorts of audiences, and I will now defer to them. So, we are starting with Johann, and formally, I think you've been told you each have 6 minutes. Some of us are better than others or worse than others at sticking to our limits. So, Johann. Yes. Yep.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for, I guess, tuning in to us. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here with everyone on the panel and everyone in the Zoom room and everyone in the physical room. I was thinking about the title of this panel, Teaching History with Integrity Today. And I hope that acting with integrity is not something new to us. But I think what is new is the context in which we're teaching. So I asked myself, integrity to whom or what? To oneself? Which part of oneself? One's partisan identity? One's racial or ethnic identity or religious identity? One's national identity? One's identity as a member of a discipline? And if it's the latter, the member of a discipline, I ask, are we willing to challenge falsehoods and myths that come at us from all sides in our survey courses? As an Americanist, I've resisted and written against calls for globalizing the survey, for example. This is not because I don't think Americans need to learn their place, the place of the United States in the global context. I absolutely do. But I think the US survey should be framed primarily around the United States because we are helping Americans understand the history of their polity in distinct contexts. This is a political project. To me, coming to terms with the nation then is part of teaching history with integrity. But I've also had to think hard recently about what I mean when I say, as a professional historian, I try to help students see complexity and nuance in the past and to challenge easy stories. When I started teaching in 2005, this usually meant challenging narratives, mostly from the right, challenge these narratives with complex alternative stories about racism or capitalism or inequality. It meant helping students understand the lies their teachers told them, to quote the book. But those misleading narratives, often cultural narratives, not necessarily always lies told by teachers, but by our broader culture, were generally evasions that came from an unwillingness to confront inequality. But today, the misleading narratives are not unidirectional. We live in a bifurcated culture where the narratives told by the right and the left both lack complexity, nuance, and the capacity to engage with other perspectives. Indeed, I argue in the essay that was circulated as part of this panel that a large part of the cultural and academic left today has embraced the post-American narrative, in which race and racism is so fundamental to the American project that there is no hope to save it. Instead, many on the left are calling for what I call a post-American history. And this call has influenced what is being taught in K-12 classrooms. And the post-American project is, I think, different than my call to think about our responsibilities as historians to the United States. That's why I'm asking today, all of you and of me, if we are willing to teach history with integrity, does that mean we are equally willing to challenge narratives that come from the left as we are to challenge narratives that come from the right? And I think it's essential that we do so. Now in my field, which is early American history, this has been really challenging, and I think it's challenging in lots of ways. It means confronting, for example, the nature of indigenous European settlement and imperialism, and of course the meaning of 1619. In other words, I have to confront misleading narratives that are supported by scholars and activists on the left. And doing so is scary. When I last taught my survey, I was worried that students would accuse me of being racist. I was worried that I was teaching ideas that I believed were true and honest according to my understanding of the historiography, but were the kind of thing that could lead to attacks on Twitter. Now let me be concrete. For example, I wanted students in my survey class to see Indigenous America as a real place where real people lived in real polities. I assigned them 2 episodes from the podcast Ben Franklin's World about the world of the Wampanoag before the Pilgrims arrived, and excerpts from James Moore's book, A Land as God Made It, Jamestown and the Birth of America, as well as Christina Snyder's book, Slavery in Indian Country. My students were surprised to discover that the Wampanoag in New England and the Algonquin in Virginia were part of robust and very real societies. They discovered that the Europeans did not create the first violent empires in North America. There were indigenous empires preceding them. They discovered that the Europeans did not bring slavery to North America. There was indigenous slavery. But they also discovered that indigenous people had culture, exercised agency, diplomacy, and engaged in commerce across vast spaces. I sought to challenge both older myths about indigenous inferiority and new narratives that have emerged on the left that, from my perspective, revive the racist myth of the noble savage. But it meant treating Native Americans as people and teaching history with integrity. My students ultimately appreciated the dignity that came with a real world with real people, not stereotypes that can be used for partisan purposes. And I had to do the same with 1619. We all know the controversies of the 1619 project. In response, I assigned Philip Morgan's essay, Virginia Slavery in Atlantic Context, which was part of a 2019 collection, Virginia 1619, Slavery and Freedom in the Making of English America. In this essay, Morgan places 1619 in the broader Atlantic world. He points out that there was nothing exceptional about slavery. In fact, English mariners feared enslavement by North Africans. When the ship the White Lion showed up in Jamestown in 1619, it needed supplies, and so they sold some of their enslaved people in return. The English did not think too much about it, Morgan writes, because slavery existed almost everywhere in the Atlantic world, including in parts of Europe. Slavery did not need explaining. Its absence would. Of course, I did not want to deny the cruelty of slavery, so I combined Morgan's essay with an excerpt from Stephanie Smallwood's book, Saltwater Slavery, in which she helps readers understand the horror of what it meant to be captured, removed from one's tribal context, placed in a fort, turned into a commodity, and brought across the ocean to work in European empires. The horror, she relates, was not just physical, but spiritual. It was about the loss of identity, and thus of the basis for oneself. I wanted to be sure that I also pushed back against right-leaning narratives that downplay the violence that accompanied the rise of racial slavery. I'll end there. But to me, this is what it means to teach history with integrity. It means first recognizing our responsibilities to the United States, to the polity, no matter what the subject of our survey. And second, it means complicating and even challenging misleading and dangerous narratives, whether they're coming to us from the right or the left. Thank you.
Thank you, Johann. My guess is that, with deference to our next 2 panelists, that if we cut off right now and ask the group to start with questions, we would be speaking for another 3 hours. I'm seeing a lot of nodding in the audience. So, Johann, you've already given this group an awful lot to chew on. So, Daniel, you get to follow this.
Great, and thanks so much for having me here. Jim, can you give me a thumbs up if I'm audible at the right level?
I think so. Everybody can hear? Yes.
Great. Okay. So I'm a U.S. historian, and particularly a historian of U.S. foreign relations. And I can tell you that when I do my thing, when I apply my trade, there is a question that looms over everything. It comes from my students, it comes from people who read my books, and that question is the United States good or is it bad? And so you can just see my students both trying to figure out.
Daniel, do you want me to take a vote right now? Then you can continue.
Oh my gosh, that's not embarrassing. Thank you for the offer. And you can see my students just trying to figure out, you're like, is this going to be one of these courses or one of those courses? And you can also see them trying to figure out, which camp they're in. And often they will say at the end of a class, I was in Camp A and now I'm in Camp B. My God, the scales have fallen from my eyes. I can see everything. Or I was in Camp B and now I'm in Camp A. Oh my God, the world looks different. And they often, by the way, it's not just is the United States, this place, good or bad. They often ask it in a different way. They often say, when my students ask it, are we good or bad? There is such a clear identification between the history of the country and the kind of moral futures that these 21st century college students have, that you can feel that they're doing something really morally intense, morally relevant, probably developmentally important in those classrooms. And I get that that's going to happen. But I also find it curious because other subjects don't totally work like this. Political science doesn't invite you to love or hate politics. Sociology doesn't invite you to love or hate society, and math definitely doesn't invite you to love or hate triangles. That we normally have an analytic relationship to our subject. Sometimes that analytic relationship is fueled by a sense of relevance that comes from a complex moral relationship. More on that in a second, we should welcome it. But I just want to notice that what gets me into the past and what gets my students and some of my readers into the past are different. And I think that's the kind of dark magic with which we historians find ourselves conjuring, whether we seek to or not. So how can we respond? What's an answer to, is the United States good or bad? I think our default answer, and it's obviously correct, is it's complicated. Of course it's complicated, right? It would be a wild reading of U.S. history if you got through the whole thing at 1619 or whatever to the president, or 1607 to the president, you said, it's all crap. Like, that would be a remarkable reading of evidence, and the other way as well. But I think we actually have a better response to it. It's complicated is a true answer, but I actually think we have a better response, which is that to say that there is a project that is, it's a single piece of U.S. history, which we can either accept or deny. That, as a historian, I don't really buy. I mean, there's this story that you get sometimes where people say, the principles, the essential core principles of the United States were this, and the entire rest of the unspooling U.S. history is an attempt to realize those principles, to achieve a more perfect union. Or sometimes you get the other version. The principles were diabolical, and everything that has happened since has been based on just, a crummy foundation. But historians totally get that things change over time. And if there ever was an essence to the United States, it has also changed over time. I'm also a little skeptical whether their countries can have thesis statements, whether they can have essences, single things that they're about. But certainly you would accept that the United States is not just in its actuality, but in its dominant ideals, wildly different now from how it was at its founding in the 18th century. That was a time when, by the first founding document, the Articles of Confederation, paupers and vagabonds were not extended the protection of law. They were just outside of the law. That's in the Articles of Confederation. This was a time when if a man and a woman had sex outside of marriage, the woman's father could sue the man for loss of services. We are in a wildly different world when we imagine that kind of legal.
So you're back to triangles, Daniel, by the way, just so you know.
Say it again?
You're back to triangles.
Yeah. A different kind of triangle.
See that? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll give you a quadrant thing in a second. When Thomas Jefferson was pressed to ask the question that my students often ask, is the United States good or bad, he pointed to the size of its quadrupeds, right? And we have large land animals, and that's how you know this is a great country. I think if the founders could look at us right now, they would less feel that we had sort of achieved a dream or departed from it, but more just be kind of vexed by our impiety, startled by the ubiquitous presence of monetary transactions in our lives, and aghast at how we coddle our children. They lived in a totally different world than we live in. So what do I take away from this? It's not that the past is not a morally interesting place, and it's not that students shouldn't have a rich relationship with it that inspires them to think carefully about the past. I mean, that's one of the things that got me into being a historian. I presume that's true of a lot of us. But I think as teachers, our role is not to be, cheerleaders, not to say yay or nay. But to model that at least our primary relationship with the past is going to be analytical. We study the past not because it's entirely a cautionary tale or a repository of timeless virtues, but because it's interesting. It's really interesting. And it's interesting in ways that kind of tweak our moral instincts, but it's also interesting in ways that have very little to do with us, right? That you know, oh my God, it's so interesting to think through this antiquarian qualities of this society and how they're different. One of the reasons the past is so interesting, by the way, is not just ethnographically, not just that it's a different country, as they say. It's interesting because there is a causal relationship between that weird past and our present, right? There's some chain of causation and events that allows us to see not just different ways societies can be, that's something that historians are really good at talking about, but also how we get from there to here, how we get from A to B, how we think about change over time, which is what historians do. And I think that kind of sense of causal connection is also really valuable for students. They may, as conservatives, want to protect the world that they've inherited. They may, as progressives, want to change the world that they inherited, but they kind of need to know how to use those levers. And I feel like our job as historians is not to teach them to hate or like the United States or hate or like its past, but to know how it works in some sense, to understand how slavery ended or the Second World War began. Those are relevant things to know. And will make them capable of operating within this country. So for me, the slogan is, as a teacher and as a historian more broadly, the point isn't to get my students or my readers to loathe the country or to love it, but to live it. Okay.
Thank you, Daniel and Johann. It's such a pleasure to speak after you. Actually, a daunting task. But, I will take your comments as a point of departure and say yes. Yes to the content, the focus, the ways that historians come to think about and teach history, and say and. I want to bring to the conversation my deep thinking about what happens when I walk into my classroom, where the history will be contested and complex and difficult, particularly when I'm teaching students who plan to become history teachers. Emotions come into that classroom with us. Affective positions come into our classrooms. And these days, a lot of fear comes into the classroom as well. Fear of what is happening in our political moment. How do I respond to it as an instructor? How do I make sense of navigating the commitment to a national project and a shared identity, civic responsibility, which most of my students, all of my students share that, Johann, and a curiosity as well, Daniel. They're driven like we are. But they're also aware of their audiences, which are young people and their parents and our legislators, particularly in Missouri and in other places. So it's not that I do anything different. The importance of historical thinking and commitment to the kinds of best that we can do in presenting historical knowledge and opportunities to our students comes in with us. But I've spent a lot of time thinking about how I show up and what I can offer students as a historian in that moment. Being a historian has opened me up to uncomfortability, to difficult challenges, to divisiveness. It just comes with the territory. And just as I'm thinking aloud about the practices and the historical thinking skills of what we do as a profession, I'm also thinking aloud with my students what it means to be a civic person in this space. Can I sit and pause with students' emotional responses when they show up, with their anger, with their pride, with their hope? I want to turn these into moments for inquiry and turn the historian skills back onto those questions. Fritz Fisher, and I think Daniel McEnany referenced the Journal of American History section. I think I caught that. Fritz argued in that section that in his essay that we need to turn the historian skills onto the present moment. That could, in fact, generate its own discussion. I want to turn the historian skills onto the practice of pausing, noticing, reflecting, and then asking historical questions and civic questions about what comes into the classroom with us, whether it's cynicism, whether it's pride, whether it's a nihilistic sort of view of the future. And that extends to not only how we talk to each other and how we are curious with each other as we go through our historical exercises, but also how we talk about people who are not in the room. So I become very deliberate in thinking about the ways that history can create a tendency to demonization. Daniel, as you allude to, good or evil. It can be a tendency to simplistic answers. Either, everybody's racist, you're racist, you're just a patriotic, fool who doesn't see the deep history. These kinds of simplistic answers to our past, as historians, we have ways of addressing them, but my students really need some modeling, walking through, coaching. They need us to be as historians, both scholars and citizens in our classrooms. So I will stop there and turn it over to Jim and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Laura. And obviously there are lots of ways to go with this. When you have an expert on Dewey and Adams ending with scholars and citizens, that just opens up 16,000 doorways. But before I throw out any questions I have, I would first like to hear the three of you. Do you have questions for each other, comments for each other? You get to throw things metaphorically since you're not in the same room. Anyway, I want to open this for discussion among the three of you before I throw out anything. Daniel, your finger is up.
This isn't a question, but maybe I just want to mark a distinction between what Johann said and what I said. I don't think that we're at daggers drawn or sort of ideological enemies in any of this. But what I heard Johann say was, we are getting battered from the left and the right, and we have to just kind of stick with the truth and resist these sort of simplifying narratives wherever they come from. I totally agree with that. But what I had recommended was a slightly different maneuver, was less the kind of resolute staying of the course, in face of fire from, both flanks, and more a kind of jujitsu move of, we're not here to play this game. I mean, we understand that there is a kind of moral force field in which you're operating, but that's not the point of this class, is to, refute all those narratives and challenge from all sides. I mean, that'll happen, but we're doing our own thing, which is we're doing something that is intellectual in a different kind of way. I'm not sure that we disagree, but I just want to mark the slight divergence, tactical divergence in the first things that we recommended, in case that becomes useful to think about.
I want to remind everybody in the room that it's okay to disagree. That's the first thing. Johann, do you want to respond?
I agree with Daniel about that. So that's my form of agreement, my disagreement. No, I think that's right. And I think part of the challenge is there's always some moral valence to the framing of any narrative. And so how do we be aware of that and accept that? And these days the moral valence is our political valence often too. And then the second part I just add to what Daniel said is that I do think that this is a question about structuring the survey. Do we, in some ways, I think Daniel's jujitsu is more staying the course because he's saying, I'm going to be a disciplinary historian. Whereas if you are saying to yourself, let's talk, you may have heard this about the founders, you may have heard this about the Civil War, you may have heard this about 1619 in the news, in the world around you. Let me use the history class as a moment to see what historians are saying and often disagreeing over these very issues. In some ways, that's a way of framing the survey in civic terms of saying, here's how historians can inform your civic knowledge. And so I think that's also part of where maybe we have a little bit of a space.
Anything else that the three of you want to pose to each other? Okay, yeah, Laura, go ahead.
I'd actually like to ask my colleagues, we're at very different institutions, and I'd like to ask you about the generational differences you see, because part of what was behind my remarks is really thinking hard about the ways that students are coming into my classroom. They're all post 9/11 for the most part now, born after 9/11, and certainly coming out of COVID. And the kinds of thinking about what the common good means, how we operate in the common good, seems very foreign to them and has put on my radar the deepening significance of a general education curriculum that explores those questions. So I'm curious if you see differences in your students over time and what they may need from us.
And I would emphasize when Laura says that you're each coming from very different spaces. Missouri, Chicago, and not far from Seattle are all very different from where our audience here is teaching. So we are talking about very different cultural, political spaces. So go ahead, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, Jim, I think I want to mark that as very important in how we think about the ways we present and challenge and open up the narrative and our teaching methods around these introductory courses.
Either of you want to respond? I mean, my question would be in response to Laura, would be to amplify that and say, how does your audience really matter when you're in a classroom? Anyway, you're nodding, Johann, and Daniel, you've got your...
I can say quickly that for me, the pandemic was what did it. The amplification of students' politics during and after the pandemic was extraordinary. I think a lot of them just spent 2 years on social media, and it really felt like a different classroom when I got back in there. In Northwestern, the students had this sort of general liberal, but with a sprinkling of Republican voters, and that turned into, you see the polarization of the country in miniature. And it also meant that, from a teaching perspective, it felt like the placement of landmines all over the terrain. As Johann said, there were a lot of things to be afraid of as a teacher.
I would only add that, I think what you said, Laura, about empathy is really important. I think when I went back after the pandemic into the physical classroom, in the context of a crazy political, social, cultural, economic world that these students are inhabiting, emotional world, as you put it, I found not only asking people to treat our subjects in the past with empathy and dignity really important, but trying to model empathy and dignity in the classroom and having students, and I think students want to. They don't have spaces where they are able to empathize with people they disagree with, or see the dignity of people they disagree with. And so it's something I felt they wanted, but didn't know where or how to start doing. And so that was something powerful that I learned with them.
So, Julia has posed a follow-up to that, which I find fascinating. The people in this room, because of the laws of the state of Texas, and Laura, your folks are dealing with this. A lot of the divisive concept laws that are being passed have an emphasis on whether teachers are making students feel guilty. And the extent to which we as historians try to we try to help students understand the concept of historical empathy and why the concept of historical empathy is essential to understanding the past. I think we probably all four of us can agree with that. And so you have this problem of we're trying to get students to situate themselves in that past in the context sometimes of legislation that says you can't make students feel guilty, you can't make students feel bad. I hope I have Julia's saying I did get it right. I'm curious as to how you feel. One of you talked about landmines, so I've just thrown a landmine out there. How do you think about this in your classroom? I know that Johann and Daniel don't have to deal with this in the legislative context, but your students might. You might have students who are going to these places, and certainly Laura does about as straightforwardly as possible, or will very soon.
Yeah, Jim, I'll start. This is a tough one.
Yeah, it is.
He's responsible for people's emotional reactions to history, to complex matters, or to anything for that matter. You know, for me, spending, I've been thinking about this a lot over the past 10 years, is we have had in the state of Missouri, actually over 10 years, the rules legislation that allows students to opt out of curriculum or activities that require them to take a position that they do not agree with or have a moral opposition to. For me, this is a fundamental point of higher education, is to be able to move outside of ourselves and our perspectives, and to see other people's points of view, whether or not we adopt them. So, I simply ask the question why. I'm clear that history isn't about making us feel guilty, but it is asking us to investigate why things happened in the past and why they affect our identity and our emotional landscape today. So if historical information makes you feel guilty, then in the classroom, I can ask why, and I can also turn to historical examples and use those as an entryway into. So we have plenty of curriculum controversies over the 20th century, so we can turn to any of those controversies and sort of explore in a way that is removed from the present moment why at that time and place others might have felt responsible. But I can't walk into the classroom being afraid of this.
So,
I think that's the biggest concern I have, is that these laws are designed to be chilling, and I don't think we can participate in them.
So Laura, let me nudge you a little bit on this. You said that your goal when you walk into that classroom is not to do things that make students feel guilty. Do you think someone earlier, and I can't remember who it was, it might have been Daniel, someone earlier referred to not guilty but uncomfortable. Do you think it's your role as a historian and history teacher to make students feel uncomfortable which is very different from guilty.
Right, and I don't have to deliberately make anyone feel uncomfortable when they investigate the past. The past makes us uncomfortable. And that is a very curious phenomenon. You know, Daniel, like, this is what you're talking about, is no other discipline, or most other disciplines don't have this effect. And so treating that as both historically and in our contemporary moment as a curious phenomenon to investigate, I think is critical. And so, you know, we can differentiate between historical questions about that and civic questions. You know, what is the mechanisms or the reasons in the moment that we're having this conversation about divisive concepts, uncomfortability, guilt in the classroom. That can turn us to, you know, that intersection of the history classroom and the civic skills that we teach or model.
Daniel, you've got your finger up.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I guess I would just add one thing. Look, the legislative context is, I agree, totally designed to be chilling, and we can't entirely logic our way out of it. But this idea that teaching truths about, you know, oppressive conditions in the past would make someone in the present uncomfortable assumes a kind of identitarian. It assumes that, you know, if you're teaching about, you know, racial violence in the Philippine War, you know, more than 100 years ago, that white students would automatically identify with the perpetrators of that violence, and thus anything kind of negative you said about that would redound to their, you know, honor or dishonor or something like that. And so I think one move that we can make intellectually is to encourage students not to immediately map themselves in a demographic sense onto the past actors and then start rooting for them. I mean, I think the laws come from a sense that any criticism of, well, let's be honest, like powerful people, often white men, in the past is a kind of crypto criticism of those same people in the present. And I think as historians, we don't have to accept that.
So Daniel,
we don't have to accept that there's a strong continuity between, you know,
right,
what color people's skins are now, or what their social position is now, and how they would have been in the past. And then there's just kind of like a trans-historical interest that is never changing. I don't think we're obliged to accept that.
Daniel, let me nudge you, if I can nudge Daniel on this a little bit. In this room, we have people who are teaching students whose great-great-grandparents, in fact, were directly implicated. They weren't, this is not the Philippines. These are people teaching students whose great-great-grandparents were slaveholders. And so the students basically are going to say, you're talking about my family. It is direct, whether you like it or not. So I'm curious, when you say, well, you know, you can get the students to remove themselves from imperialism in the Philippines. Can you do the same thing when you're teaching south of the Mason-Dixon line?
I want to really acknowledge how challenging it is. I mean, the biggest challenges I've had in the classroom, so I teach U.S. foreign relations, so there's often a version of this is, my father served in that war, my grandfather served in that war, and was on the side, you know, and it did some of the things that you described, and I like my grandfather very much. And yeah, that's hard. It's often the direct familial identifications that are ways to sort of port us into positions in the past. And I don't have a sort of magic wand to make that go away, but you know, we get to decide what our heritage, what our genetics or direct familial heritage means to us, and we get to decide what parts of, you know, what our foreparents did are incumbent on us, and how much we have to identify with them and their values.
Laura, you were going to jump in there when I jumped in instead of you.
No, that was a great follow-up, Jim. And I do, you know, teach in a state that was the bloodiest internally, and online teaching for us means that now I have students from all across the state in my online courses. So these issues have actually increased, the concerns about
familial identity. I think, and you know, what I only wanted to say, Daniel, is that is the why question for me. And what, I don't have an answer to this for students, but I want them to wrestle with why. You know, why, it's not only family that leads us to this kind of identification. There are cultural and you know, academic, you know, scholarly, what we've learned in school, all kinds of layers that lead to students' assumptions about how they should feel and assumptions about who they are. And really turning these questions is to get them to think about that. Can we imagine a different future for who we are and how we act in this world? I mean, this, I think, Johann, is sort of the interesting piece running through your conversation about post-America. You know, like these narratives we have, they're starting points for understanding the conflicts we have, but might they also be starting points for imagining different futures? So historians aren't in the business of doing that, but that is something that I'm really curious about with my students, is do they feel this politics of inevitability or you know, a sort of tyranny to the past that we can't break free of how we have, and by we I mean humans. Doesn't matter, you know, your identity group. Humans have done these terrible things to each other. So can we imagine something different in our structures right now?
Johann, did you want to weigh in on this, or should we move on?
I think it's okay to move on.
Okay.
You know.
Well, I'm sort of going to move on because it's now time for our audience participation, but we're going to do this in part by my first asking you a very pointed question. When Daniel was speaking, he started saying the word heritage. You got the whole word out and then you pulled back from it. And I'm curious, how many people in this room think that it's important in your teaching of history that the concept of heritage is important, that part of what you're doing is helping students understand their heritage, and that the students are there because they're trying to understand their heritage? I'm just curious, show of hands. Okay, so pretty good chunk. I'm guessing that none of the three of you read Steve Kahn's piece about 5 or 6 years ago that I've referred a lot of people to, called History or Heritage. It was a short op-ed. He was writing in response to the debate over Confederate monuments, so the valence was to some extent in a different direction. He was criticizing the position that these monuments are important because they're part of our heritage. But the argument that he made was that the goal of heritage is to make you feel good. That the goal of heritage is to make you feel comfortable, whether it's heritage tourism or related issues. And that the goal of history is to make us feel uncomfortable, or at least to confront what's uncomfortable. Half the people in this room have said, yes, heritage is important to my teaching of history, and we've just had this little conversation about discomfort. So I'm just kind of curious as to how the three of you think about this. We have this problem where there's an expectation. Students come in, they want to know about their heritage. In many states, when people talk about state standards, when they talk about inclusion issues, they talk about heritage. And now we're setting these things, if not as dichotomies, we're certainly setting them in conversation. So I'm curious as to what you think, and then we're going to take some audience questions.
Let me just jump into that and say, you know, I think it's a particular problem for any historians who are teaching the history of their group, right? This could be meaning national historians. This would be the problem for French historians in France. It can also be ethno-religious It can be a problem of African American historians with African Americans, or Jewish historians with, with the Jewish community. These are group problems of teaching about groups. And I would say, the way I think about it is using a different word that is related to heritage, which is inheritance. That in some ways, when I'm teaching American history to Americans, this is your inheritance. And this inheritance is complicated. It's not all good. It has obligations that come with it. It's not just feel good, but it's something that you have to feel that you are inheriting, that this is part of who you are, and there are some things that you want to carry forward, there are some issues that are alive, and there are some problems that you want to resolve. And I think it's okay for us to sort of see that there's a link between inheritance, heritage, and history.
Daniel.
Oh, I was just gesturing to see if Laura
You
wants to
were,
make
okay. Laura, did you want to weigh in on this? Otherwise, we'll go to questions from the group. You're okay.
I just want to
Yeah.
something Johann said, which is that all this talk of is it history or heritage assumes a one-to-one relationship between the students and the place being studied. And I mean, I know that it varies from educational context and educational context.
Yeah.
But I have to give my students a lecture at Northwestern. It's like, a lot of you are going to think that the history of the United States is the history of we or of us. But this is like empirically untrue of many of these people in this room. We're either their forebears were not in the country at the time we're discussing, or they're not even citizens of the country. And so the idea that history can only be a kind of story, professional historians know that that's not true. And I think we have the option to model for our students. There are all kinds of histories, and they don't have to be first-person histories.
You're going to get me, Daniel, in real trouble with my colleagues at Oxford University Press, who publishes the American Historical Review, because they have a best-selling history book called The History of Us. So we'll just keep that out of this. Okay, Julia has a microphone. Julia, Tamiko.
Is it still morning? Good morning. My name is Tamiko Meeks, and I teach at Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas.
Louder, because I'm not sure how well the mic is working. So,
My name is Tamiko Meeks. I teach at Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas. And this is, I guess, a question for everyone, maybe most specifically to Johann. So you talked about the 1619 project, and I'm just wondering, is this something that you do with your introductory classes? And if it is, I'm just curious how you are able to do this, especially considering that you said that you pulled in Stephanie Smallwood and some of the other monographs. And I say that because we used the 1619 as a common read for our freshmen. And we, did several things, but we did not use it in our introductory classes, right? And to pull in other monographs and have them read people like Smallwood and even Gomez or Fredrickson, that's a heavy lift. And I'm just trying to figure out how you do that. I could see you doing that in upper level classes, right? Because that's pretty intense. And to have to do that sort of historiography and work that out with students, I really think that that's something that you do in an upper level class, because at the introductory level, you're just like introducing them to primary sources and getting them to understand how to look at documents. And something that, I'm sorry, Laura, I don't mean to use your first name, talked about, I think you really have to consider your demographic and like the student population that you're working with before you like really dig into something like that.
So I should tell the three of you that there are heads nodding in the audience as Tomiko was saying this. And actually, one of the questions I even had as I was listening to you, the three of you, was how do we go from this conversation to the actual classroom? So responses.
Yes, so the readings I was referring to are actually from my Civic course. 100 level. I teach at a regional, state institution, Western Washington. We're kind of a workhorse kind of four-year college public education. Our students come in with very divergent skills. I mean, some could be in the Ivy League, and some really struggle to read and write well at the college level. And what I've done, and Laura knows this stuff better than I do, but I really work on structuring the reading and the writing process. So for me, I really think about each of these readings as vista points. I sort of tell them a thesis is an opening. It's an invitation to see the world from a certain vista point. That's why we need to always start by knowing what that thesis is. And thinking about narratives. What happens if we see 1619 as the fundamental starting date for the story of American racism? And what happens if we see 1619 as just one more ship in a very wide and busy Atlantic Ocean? How do these stories differ? And what do we do with that? Why? And I think part of it for me is just really working with students to help them read well, giving them structure. But I don't tell them we're doing historiography, like I'm training to be a professional historian. I tell them we're learning how to see how narratives are made and how historians put together narratives and how those narratives might affect us. And that's why we need to understand what we call the thesis and the argument and the significance and all these things that we look for when we read. And I think the students rise to it. I mean, they struggle, and that's why I have to put a lot of scaffolding. But I think they rise to it, and I repeat it over and over with different meetings. And so I try really hard to help them do it in the classroom. Not just anticipate that they'll get everything, if they read it out on their own. We do a lot of it in the class, I guess. It doesn't always work either, by the way. A lot of times it doesn't work well.
If everything we did worked, that would probably mean that we're failing as teachers because we're not doing anything that's risky or difficult, actually. Laura, Daniel, did you want to respond? Laura, you want to? Either of you?
Well, I had a difficult time hearing the question, but I think there was a question in there. Johann, do you have your students read the entire book?
I have them read 2 entire books, and then usually chapters or articles, and then primary sources.
From the 1619?
No, I don't have them read the entire book of the 1619 project. We more discuss, we raise it in class, what have they heard about it, and then we read Morgan's essay. Or at least this time around. I mean, the survey changes, the class I'm referring to.
Is there another question here? Yeah? Or Daniel, why don't you continue to address that?
While Julia's bringing the microphone up, I think that the question, though, and the answer does raise a question I've thought about a lot in the last 20 years even, which is, and I know others have, which is whether we have fetishized primary sources to the point where we're actually not challenging our students with secondary sources as much as might be useful. Because we need to remember that for us, a newspaper is a primary source. For a student, whether it's online newspaper or whatever, it's a secondary source because they're reading it as information about something. And they are evaluating journalism in the same way, in some ways, that they might be evaluating secondary sources. So just a question to throw out there. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to say this. Say again? Oh, yeah. My name is Jay Sutton. I just started at Texas State Technical College as an instructor, but I spent the last 5 years as a dual credit and AP instructor at the high school level. By the way, I'm just thrilled to be here. This is such a great discussion, so interesting. My question is for Dr. Neem. I totally agree with your point, by the way, about having to contend and sort of dismantle some of these different narratives coming at us from both the right and the left. And I'll try to speak up a little bit. My question is, do you believe that these threats are equal in power? Because I have to tell you, from my experience as a K through 12 educator for the last 5 years, I more so found myself contending with the right narrative. And I believe that's because it's really been the entrenched narrative for the past 20 or 30 years. I mean, we all know that. And I know that we as professional historians are more familiar with like the 1619 Project and some of these other post-America scholars, but from my experience, I haven't seen that dilute down into the general education, the general public as of yet. I know that's happening more and more as time goes on, but yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Johann, were you able to hear that?
I think it's complicated. And I agree that it depends. That's also location specific. You know, I'm teaching in a context that is very liberal, both my local school district and our university, and in some ways, some of the power in our state, although our state is much more mixed. Although I don't presume that of all my students, of course. And others are not. The way I think about it is that, you know, just really quickly, I think I think these laws against divisive concepts are bad, and they're hopefully unconstitutional, but they're definitely designed to chill. But they're the equivalent of the left's version of defund police. What they are is when you have no sway over a cultural institution with much influence or a political institution with much influence, you can't shape the bureaucracy from inside. You kind of use a sledgehammer to try to force it because you have legislative power. And so I think we shouldn't, I think that threat is probably a bigger threat at this moment, and certainly the threat of violence and the threat to democracy coming from the right is a bigger threat to our republic. But I think when we're thinking about these cultural narratives, we have to realize that the left has really influenced the way K-12 education is, and a lot of what humanities scholars take as sort of their baseline. And these are powerful institutions. The right is not wrong about that.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on this point and say, yes, I'm in a state where I hear what our questioner is reporting, and yet I'm also aware in my classroom that students come in with assumptions, and they come in with assumptions about me and my positionality as a professional historian. And when our classroom becomes a place that kind of defaults to a way of speaking about the past or about civic issues and political issues as though we all agree, and maybe there's some small differences around the edges, but we all agree. This is, I'm concerned about, because that is a space that is mine to model something different. And so while I can be concerned with the larger issues for the Republic and on the national level and at the state level discourse, I am much more attentive in my classroom to holding all of us, welcoming all of us into conversation to get to know each other. And these seem maybe like modest or naive goals, but I think this is where our students are longing to live right now, and they don't have many models or spaces to enact those kinds of relationships. So it's been very important to me to make it clear in my classroom that we make no assumptions about other people's political views or values, but our work is to inquire about them when they emerge in the context of trying to understand the past.
Well, otherwise we're going to bring, I'm getting the signal from Julia. And I want to say that one thing about the format of this that I'm not learning, it's not news to me, is that one of the problems is the three of you cannot see when people in the audience are nodding, when people in the audience are raising their eyebrows. But when I speak in public, I generally look around a lot and see whether people are paying attention, because I know whether I'm dying or not, and whether I have to reposition everything. And what I can say to the three of you is this audience has been rapt, R-A-P-T, not W-R-A, that you have really drawn people's attention here. And I'm going to take the privilege of the chair, actually, just to two things to wrap up with. One is, Laura, you made a reference to something I don't know that I've ever heard anybody say, which I find really important, which is I'm in a lot of rooms where, virtual and otherwise, where people talk about positionality, subject position, and various other synonyms. And sometimes I've said that my last column as AHA Executive Director is going to start with my subject position as historian. You said that. You said my positionality is as a historian. And there's a way in which I think as teachers, it helps us when we think about that in the classroom. But the second thing is a few of you used landmines as a metaphor. And here I'm going to, because I do believe that what we do is personal, my daughter has had jobs, 2 of them at least, in places where there are landmines. And
Actual ones that exist.
actual landmines. We're talking Kosovo, Ukraine. And the instructions that they have, the rules of her employer, and she knows how to drive a 5-ton armored vehicle. The rule is you're not allowed to drive off the road. That's how they avoid the landmines. That's how they are instructed to avoid the landmines, is to stay on the paved road. And I think if we think of, it's an interesting metaphor in thinking about the landmines that we deal with and whether or not that's the best way for us. Because maybe that's what some of the legislatures want us to do, is stay on the paved road. I mean, you could extend this metaphor probably in ways that are ridiculous, but it's worth thinking about, I think, in terms of how we remain aware of the landmines and how we deal with them. And I want to thank the three of you very much. You have gotten yourself in a little bit of trouble because this has worked so well that we may be asking you to do this again. So thank you, and thanks everybody for listening.